I caught my wife cheating and decided to take revenge by ruining her affair partner's relationship. The first time I noticed something was off. It was subtle, too subtle to raise alarms. My wife, Jessica, had been glued to her phone more often, sharing less about her day, and laughing at things she wouldn't explain. It wasn't a typical withdrawal, but a gentle shift in her warmth. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly felt stilted, as if she were hiding behind a curtain I couldn't see through. At first I brushed it off, chalking it up to stress from work, or the exhaustion of juggling 2 young kids in a busy household. But in the quiet moments doubt would creep in, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. One evening, the telltale signs became impossible to ignore. Jessica sat across from me at the dinner table, absently swirling her fork through a plate of pasta, her mind clearly elsewhere. When I asked if everything was okay, she forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired," she said. But there was a crack in her voice that made my stomach twist. The love I knew was there, but something had changed. That night, as she fell asleep beside me, I lay awake, the question pounding in my mind: was she hiding something from me? The next day I decided to trust my gut and check our phone records. I had never felt the need to invade Jessica's privacy before, but the list of unfamiliar numbers and frequent, late-night calls told a story I wasn't ready to hear. One number in particular stood out: calls at odd hours, sometimes lasting over an hour. I didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me, but the evidence was damning. Jessica was talking to someone else, and it wasn't just innocent chatter. The pit in my stomach grew, and I knew I was on the brink of discovering something that could tear our world apart. Confrontation wasn't something I did lightly, but this was different. I couldn't let it fester any longer. I chose my moment carefully, waiting for the kids to be asleep and the house to be quiet. "Jess, who's the guy you've been calling?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face before she masked it with indignant confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice too calm, too measured. I pulled out the phone records, placing them on the table between us. "These," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Who is this?" For a moment, I thought she might deny it, spin some tale to pacify me. But her shoulders sagged and the fight drained from her. "It's not what you think," she whispered. But we both knew that was a lie. My heart broke as I watched the woman I loved search for words to justify the betrayal. She confessed it was someone from work: David, a married coworker. They'd grown close over the past year, she claimed, and it started innocently. It always does. But she admitted it had become something more. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. I sat there, numb, realizing that the life I thought we had was slipping through my fingers. But I wasn't the only one who would suffer from this revelation. David had a family too, and they deserved to know. Jessica's confession left me reeling, but anger simmered beneath the surface of my heartbreak. The betrayal wasn't just between us anymore. David's wife deserved to know the truth, just as I had learned it. However, I wasn't about to rush into this without solid evidence. If I was going to expose David, I needed more than Jessica's reluctant confession. I needed proof that couldn't be denied. It was no longer about revenge, it was about justice for 2 families shattered by selfish choices. I began my investigation quietly, poring over phone records, messages, and social media activity. Jessica had tried to delete their texts, but I managed to recover enough to piece together the timeline. They met up after work, exchanged flirtatious messages, and even planned secret rendezvous during lunch breaks. Each discovery was like a knife to my heart, yet I pressed on, fueled by a sense of duty to the truth. I wasn't just fighting for my own closure, I was fighting for David's wife and kids, who were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. In one particularly incriminating message, David suggested they spend the weekend together while telling their spouses they had work obligations. It was all I needed. I took screenshots of everything, organized it into a timeline, and compiled it into a folder labeled Truth. I wasn't proud of the lengths I went to, but it was necessary. When the time came, David wouldn't be able to weasel out of the consequences. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was a reckoning. With the evidence in hand, I faced the hardest decision yet: how to tell David's wife. Her name was Emily. I knew about her through Jessica's occasional mentions of David's family, and I found her on social media. She seemed kind, vibrant, and devoted to her children. Seeing her smiling photos with David made my stomach turn, knowing the devastation I was about to bring into her life. But she had a right to know. I arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe, careful to keep the tone respectful and calm. When Emily arrived, she was warm and unsuspecting, her eyes full of curiosity and mild concern. "I'm not sure why you wanted to meet," she said, smiling politely. My hands trembled as I pushed the folder across the table. I'm so sorry, I said softly. But there's something you need to see. Her smile faltered as she opened the folder, her face draining of color as she flipped through the pages. Each message, each photo, etched lines of pain deeper into her features. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why I didn't have an answer, only the truth that neither of us could escape. I sat there in silence, letting her absorb the betrayal. She thanked me through tears, not for the pain I caused but for giving her the truth she deserved. In that moment we were two strangers bound by shared betrayal, navigating a storm neither of us had asked for. I had done what I set out to do, but the hollow victory brought no solace. After meeting Emily, I returned home with the weight of what I'd done pressing on my chest. Jessica was waiting for me, sitting on the couch with tear-streaked cheeks. She must have sensed something had shifted. Where were you? She asked, her voice trembling with both fear and guilt. I hesitated, debating whether to tell her now or let her find out later. But there was no point in secrecy anymore. I met with David's wife, I said, watching the shock ripple across her face. Her mouth opened and closed, as if searching for the right words to undo what had already been done. You told her, she finally whispered, horror dawning in her eyes. I nodded, my voice cold. She deserves to know, Jess. Just like I deserved to know the truth. Jessica broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, but this time I didn't comfort her. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. I never wanted this, she cried, burying her face in her hands. You've ruined his family. I felt a surge of bitter anger. No, you ruined it. Both of you. Her tears did nothing to soften the ache in my chest. I wasn't proud of what I had done, but I also knew it was the right thing. The truth had consequences, and we were all living them now. The fallout for David was swift and brutal. Emily confronted him that night, armed with the evidence I had provided. He couldn't deny it, couldn't lie his way out. Within hours, the cracks in his carefully constructed life began to spread. Emily kicked him out of the house, and word quickly spread among their mutual friends and co-workers. His career took a hit as whispers of his affair began circulating in the office. He had gambled everything on a fleeting affair, and now he was losing it all. Jessica received a message from David the next day, a desperate plea for sympathy. He blamed me for ruining his life, as if my discovery was the real betrayal. You could have stopped him, he wrote. We could have fixed this quietly. Jessica showed me the message, her hands trembling. What do you expect me to do? She asked, her voice hollow. I shrugged. It's not my problem, I said coldly. He made his choices just like you did. I expected Jessica to be furious, but she seemed more resigned than angry. David's life was crumbling, and now she had to face the wreckage of our marriage. He lost everything, she whispered, as if hoping for some shred of comfort. I had none to give. So did we, I replied, walking away, leaving her to sit in the silence she had helped create. The days that followed were bleak. Our home, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become a cold, quiet battleground. Jessica tried to reach out, to mend the pieces, but I was too hurt to respond. She cooked my favorite meals, left notes apologizing, but nothing could erase the image of her betrayal. I couldn't look at her without remembering the messages, the lies, the nights spent in someone else's arms. Our children sensed the tension, their innocent questions piercing through the thick wall of silence between us. Why isn't Mommy smiling? Our youngest asked one morning, his big eyes wide with concern. Jessica forced a smile, her voice trembling. Mommy's just tired, sweetie, but I saw the truth in her eyes. She was breaking, just like I was. And in the middle of it all were two innocent children, who didn't deserve the mess we had made. I began sleeping in the guest room, unable to share a bed with her anymore. The divide between us grew wider with each passing day, and I found myself wondering if it could ever be repaired. Love, once vibrant and strong, had been replaced by a hollow echo of what once was. And yet, despite everything, part of me still longed for the life we had before the betrayal. But the question lingered, was forgiveness even possible? The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself but the questions from our children, who were too young to understand why everything felt different. They sensed the change even if we tried to shield them from it. Our eldest, Sarah, was just 7 but already perceptive beyond her years. One evening she crawled onto my lap and asked, Daddy, why don't you and Mommy laugh together anymore? Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she was afraid of the answer. I struggled to find the right words, my throat tightening. Sometimes grown-ups go through hard times, I said carefully. But we both love you very much, and that will never change. She frowned, her little face scrunched in confusion. But you don't love Mommy anymore? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced at Jessica, who stood in the doorway, watching silently, her face pale and drawn. It's complicated, sweetheart, I finally answered, feeling the weight of the truth crush me. Jessica stepped forward, kneeling beside us. "We're still a family," she said, her voice breaking, tears brimming in her eyes. No matter what, Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded and hugged us both. In that moment I realized how deeply our actions had affected them. They were the true victims in all of this, caught in the crossfire of decisions they had no control over. It wasn't just our marriage at stake, it was their sense of security, their happiness. As the days passed, I found myself seeking solace outside the home. I started spending more time at the gym, taking long walks, and even confiding in an old friend, Mark. He had been my best friend since college, and though we hadn't spoken much recently, he welcomed me with open arms. Over a few beers I poured out the whole story, from the first suspicion to the confrontation with Emily. Mark listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed in sympathy. "You did what you had to do," he said finally, his voice steady. "But now you have to decide what's next. Do you want to save your marriage, or are you ready to walk away?" His words hit me hard, because I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. I had been consumed by anger and hurt, but now I was faced with the question of what came next. Could I forgive Jessica? Did I even want to? "I don't know," I admitted, staring into my beer. "I feel like I'll never trust her again." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Trust is hard to rebuild, but it's possible. The question is, do you still love her enough to try?" I didn't have an answer, but the question lingered long after I left, echoing in my mind as I walked home through the quiet, dark streets. That night as I returned home, I found Jessica waiting for me in the living room. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Reluctantly, I sat down, unsure if I wanted to hear whatever she had to say. She took a deep breath, wringing her hands nervously. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice shaking. "But I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and regret. "I've already ended things with David," she continued. "I told him I never want to see or speak to him again. It was a mistake, the worst mistake of my life, and I hate myself for it." She paused, her eyes searching mine for any sign of forgiveness. "I'm willing to go to counseling, to do whatever it takes. Just, please, don't give up on us." I stared at her, my heart a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hope that we could rebuild what had been broken. But another part of me, the part still raw with betrayal, couldn't see a way forward. "I don't know if I can," I said finally, my voice hollow. Her face crumpled, and for the first time I saw the true depth of her remorse. But was it enough? Could love ever truly heal the wounds betrayal left behind? Jessica was true to her word, and within a week she had arranged our first marriage counseling session. I wasn't sure what to expect, but part of me hoped the therapist might have some magic answer, a way to erase the pain and restore what we'd lost. The therapist, Dr. Miller, was calm and compassionate, with a soft voice that somehow made the heavy atmosphere in the room feel less suffocating. After introductions, Dr. Miller asked us both to describe what brought us there. Jessica went first, her voice trembling with emotion. She admitted her guilt, her deep regret, and her desire to rebuild our marriage. She spoke about how lost she had felt, and how she was willing to do anything to make things right. I listened, arms crossed, feeling like a spectator to her confessional. When it was my turn, I wasn't sure where to begin. "I don't know if I'm here to fix things, or just to understand why," I said finally, my voice cold. "I feel like the person I trusted most ripped my heart out, and I don't know if that's something you can fix." Dr. Miller nodded thoughtfully. "It's okay not to know yet," she said. "What matters is that you're here, willing to explore those feelings. Healing takes time, and it's a journey we'll take step by step." But I wasn't sure if I was ready for that journey, or if it would lead anywhere worth going. In the days following the counseling session, I realized just how much trust haunted our home like a ghost. Every time Jessica's phone buzzed, I found myself tense, watching for signs of deceit. She noticed, of course, and went out of her way to be transparent, leaving her phone face up, telling me where she was going and when she'd be back. But the trust we had before was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of suspicion. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, Jessica spoke quietly, almost as if to herself. "I don't know how to make you trust me again." I didn't respond at first, staring at the muted TV instead. Finally I said, "You can't. It's not something you can make happen." The words hung between us, heavy and bitter. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "Then why are you still here?" she whispered. "Why?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Part of me still loved her, still clung to the memories of what we once had. Another part of me stayed for the kids, who deserved a family, that didn't crumble under the weight of betrayal. Because leaving feels like losing even more, I said finally, the sadness in my voice matching hers. We were both trapped, caught between love and pain, unsure if we could ever find our way back to each other. While Jessica and I struggled to navigate the aftermath of the affair, news of David's downfall reached me through mutual acquaintances. Emily had filed for divorce, and David was living in a cheap apartment across town, isolated and bitter. His reputation at work was in tatters, and there were whispers that he might lose his job altogether. Jessica told me once that she had received a final, desperate message from him, begging her to come back, but she had ignored it. He's lost everything, she said one evening, as if seeking some kind of solace in sharing his downfall. He deserves it, I replied, without hesitation. There was no pity in my heart for him, no sympathy for the man who had helped destroy my marriage. Jessica looked away, her face pale and drawn. And what about me, she asked softly. Do I deserve to lose everything too? Her question caught me off guard, and for a moment I had no answer. She had betrayed me, yes, but she was still the mother of my children, still the woman I had once loved deeply. I don't know, I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. But I do know that I'm not ready to let go yet. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start, a small crack in the wall I had built around my heart. Whether it would grow into something more, I didn't know. But for now, it was all I had to offer. The kids became the fragile thread holding our broken home together. Despite our best efforts to shield them, they felt the tension, saw the cracks in our once happy life. Sarah, ever observant, asked fewer questions but watched us with worried eyes. Our youngest, Liam, only 4, clung to Jessica more often, sensing something was wrong but too young to understand. Every moment with them was bittersweet, a reminder of what we were fighting to preserve or what we were already losing. One Saturday morning, while we sat around the breakfast table in strained silence, Sarah suddenly spoke up. Are you and Mommy going to get a divorce? The question landed like a bomb, and Jessica's hand froze mid-reach for her coffee. I exchanged a glance with her, seeing the same mixture of fear and guilt mirrored in her eyes. No, Jessica said quickly, her voice trembling. We're not going anywhere. But Sarah wasn't convinced. You don't talk to each other like you used to, she said, her voice quivering. I reached across the table and took her small hand in mine. We're going through a hard time, but we love you and Liam very much, I assured her. That will never change, Jessica nodded, blinking back tears. In that moment I realized the stakes weren't just about us anymore. We owed it to our children to try, no matter how painful it was. Determined to prove she was committed to repairing our marriage, Jessica began making sacrifices. She cut ties with mutual friends who had enabled her affair, blocked David on every platform, and even quit her job, despite how much it hurt her career. I want you to know I'm serious, she said one evening, placing her resignation letter on the table. I'm willing to give up everything if it means earning back your trust. I was surprised by the gesture, but it only left me more conflicted. Her actions showed remorse, but could I ever truly forget? You didn't have to quit, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. This isn't just about your job. She shook her head. It's not about that anymore. I need to show you I'm all in. Her determination was clear, but it only highlighted the depth of the damage done. Despite everything, I could see she was trying. She stayed home more, focused on the kids, and tried to rebuild the connection we had lost. But every kind gesture, every attempt at closeness, reminded me of what had been broken. Even as she worked tirelessly to repair the cracks, I wondered if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. One evening after a particularly long day, we sat on the back porch, watching the sunset in silence. The kids were asleep, and for the first time in weeks the quiet didn't feel oppressive. Jessica handed me a glass of wine, her eyes soft but cautious, as if waiting for permission to break the tension. Do you remember our first date? She asked suddenly, her voice filled with a wistful longing. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth despite myself. The Italian restaurant with the terrible service, I said, and she laughed, a genuine, warm laugh I hadn't heard in so long. And the waiter who spilled wine on your lap, she added, smiling. For a moment, the weight of everything lifted, and we were just two people reminiscing about simpler times. I miss this, she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I miss us. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel anger or resentment, just a deep, aching sadness. I miss it too, I admitted quietly. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step, a tiny glimmer of hope in the midst of our shattered lives. Whether it would be enough, I still didn't know, but it was something. In the weeks that followed, Jessica and I slowly established a fragile routine. Mornings became less tense, and evenings were spent together with the children, playing games or watching movies. We weren't pretending everything was fine. There were still moments of silence, tension, and unspoken pain, but there were also glimpses of normalcy. It felt like we were walking a tightrope, balancing between past betrayal and a future that felt uncertain. Jessica threw herself into making things right, not just for me but for the family. She planned family outings, helped Sarah with school projects, and patiently answered Liam's endless questions. I noticed how tired she looked, how much effort it took to maintain this fragile peace, and though part of me wanted to let my guard down, the fear of being hurt again kept me distant. One night as we cleaned up after dinner, Jessica spoke softly, breaking the quiet. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I hope you can see I'm trying." I glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. "I see it," I replied, my voice neutral. She nodded, though the weight of my detachment lingered between us. It was progress, but it wasn't enough, not yet. One afternoon there was a knock at the door that shattered the delicate peace we'd begun to build. When I opened it, I found Emily standing there. Her face was pale, and her expression unreadable. My stomach dropped. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I stepped aside, letting her in, the air thick with tension. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her face draining of color at the sight of Emily. Emily didn't waste time. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for telling me the truth." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, unable to meet Emily's gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Emily continued. I needed to see it for myself. To see if you're really trying to fix what you broke." Her words were laced with a quiet strength, and for the first time I saw the depth of her resilience. Jessica wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." Emily nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I don't forgive you," she said bluntly, "but I hope you can do better. For your family's sake." She turned to me, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "Take care of yourself," she said quietly before leaving, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. After Emily left, Jessica broke down, collapsing onto the couch in tears. "I don't know how to fix this," she sobbed. "I don't know how to fix this." I sat beside her, unsure of what to say. Her remorse was genuine, but the pain still lingered, a constant reminder of what had been lost. "You can't undo it," I said, my voice softer than before. "But maybe we can figure out how to move forward." She looked at me through tear-filled eyes, hope flickering faintly. "Do you think we ever will?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have a definitive answer, but for the first time I allowed myself to consider the possibility. "Maybe," I said quietly. "If we're both willing to keep trying." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the closest I had come to it since everything fell apart. That night, for the first time in months, I stayed in our shared bedroom. We didn't touch, didn't speak much, but the distance between us felt smaller. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but there was a sense that, perhaps, we weren't entirely lost. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close to it. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the sharp edges of our pain softened. Jessica and I began to rediscover each other in small, cautious ways. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, wrapped in blankets against the crisp autumn air. It was quiet, peaceful in a way that felt fragile but welcome. Jessica broke the silence, her voice gentle. "Do you remember how we used to dream about traveling together once the kids were older?" I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Italy," I said. "You wanted to eat your weight in gelato." She laughed softly, the sound genuine, and for a moment it felt like we were those people again before everything fell apart. "We lost a lot," I said after a pause, my voice serious. "But I don't want to lose everything." Her eyes met mine, hopeful but wary. "Neither do I," she whispered. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the hum of crickets and the cool night air, it felt like the beginning of something new, not quite a fresh start, but a tentative step forward. Despite the progress, memories of the affair lingered like ghosts. One afternoon I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of family vacations, birthdays, and ordinary moments that now felt bittersweet. Jessica walked in, noticing the photos on the screen, and sat beside me, her expression somber. "I miss those days," she said softly. "So do I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know if we can ever get back to that." She nodded, her face pained but resolute. "Maybe we can't," she said. "But maybe we can build something new." Her words struck a chord, and I realized that clinging to the past might be the very thing keeping us from moving forward. Later that evening I took down the framed family photo from our mantel, the one taken just before everything fell apart. I replaced it with a new photo, one of all four of us at the park from the week before. It wasn't perfect, and neither were we, but it felt like a small step towards something better. Jessica noticed and smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. The true test of trust came unexpectedly. Jessica had an old friend, Rachel, who invited her to a weekend retreat for women focused on healing and growth. She hesitated, unsure if leaving would cause more harm than good. "I want to go," she admitted, "but I don't want you to feel like I'm running away." Her eyes searched mine, full of uncertainty. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pang of doubt, but I also knew that trust wouldn't grow if I kept her on a leash. "You should go," I said finally. "We'll be fine." Jessica's relief was palpable, and she hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you." It was the first time I had given her the freedom without the weight of suspicion, and though it terrified me, it also felt necessary. During the weekend we stayed in touch through brief phone calls and texts. It wasn't easy. There were moments when my mind wandered to dark places, but I pushed through. When she returned, her face glowing with a renewed sense of purpose, I felt a small but significant shift. Trust, I realized, wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be given, piece by piece. When Jessica returned from the retreat, she seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. She hugged the kids tightly, showering them with kisses, then turned to me with a soft smile. "Thank you," she said again, her eyes filled with sincerity. There was something different in her gaze, something I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't guilt or desperation anymore. It was hope. That evening, after the kids were asleep, we sat together on the couch. The silence between us felt different, no longer heavy with unspoken resentment. "I realized something this weekend," she began, her voice steady. "I've been so focused on fixing us that I forgot to forgive myself. I know I hurt you and I'll always regret that. But I also need to believe I can be better." Her words hung in the air, and I felt the walls I'd built begin to crumble. I'd been holding on to the pain, because I was afraid that letting it go meant I was okay with what happened, I admitted. But maybe it's time to stop punishing both of us. For the first time I reached for her hand, intertwining my fingers with hers. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the closest we'd come. We decided to renew our vows, not as a way to erase the past, but to acknowledge the journey we had taken, and the new chapter we were starting. It was a small, private ceremony in our backyard, with just the kids and a few close friends who had supported us through the darkest days. Sarah and Liam were thrilled, and their excitement was contagious, filling the air with a sense of joy I hadn't felt in months. Jessica wore a simple white dress, her hair loose and flowing. She looked beautiful, but it was the peace in her eyes that struck me most. When it was time to speak our vows, her voice trembled with emotion. "I can't promise to be perfect," she said, her eyes glistening with tears, "but I promise to be honest, to listen, and to keep fighting for us." When it was my turn, I took a deep breath. "I can't promise to forget," I said, my voice steady, "but I can promise to forgive. To trust, even when it's hard. And to keep building a life together." As we exchanged rings again, I felt something shift inside me, a release, a letting go of the past. It wasn't the end of our struggle, but it was the beginning of something new. Life didn't magically become perfect after the vow renewal, but it did become easier. We had good days and hard days, moments of laughter and moments of struggle. But the difference was that we were facing it together, as a team. The scars from the affair would always be there, but they no longer defined us. They were reminders of how far we had come. Jessica found a new job, one that allowed her more time with the kids and less stress. I continued to work on rebuilding trust, not just in her but in myself, the trust that I could move past the betrayal and find peace. We went to counseling less frequently, but we still checked in with Dr. Miller when we needed it, understanding that healing was a lifelong process. One night as we tucked the kids into bed, Sarah looked up at me and asked, "Are you happy now?" I glanced at Jessica, who stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm. "Yeah," I said, smiling, "I think I am." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I meant it. We had been broken, but we had found a way to piece ourselves back together, not perfectly, but enough.